Beneath the Jungle of Cozumel, Connecting the Crowns, Book 1, by Rob Netto, narration by the author. Chapter 1, Continuous Guidelines. 1,100 feet was a walk in the park for a seasoned cave diver. The distance wasn't the issue. It took about 25 minutes to swim through the maze of water-filled tunnels to the area I was interested in. That took into account having to stop and bridge the gaps between permanent guidelines with the spooled-up lines we carried. Running a line from just below the surface of the tannic-stained cenote to the beginning of the guideline that was only 10 feet inside of the cave entrance took me less than a minute. Once the lifeline to the surface was secured to the permanent guideline in the cave, I swam 300 feet through the middle of a halocline, breaking out of the blurriness and encountering the first gap in the line. A gap was a space between two guidelines, and it was usually more than 10 feet long. This one was about 15 feet long. I grabbed another spool of line and closed the gap between the two guidelines by securing one end of the line on my spool to one guideline and letting out enough line to secure the other end to the other guideline. If I just swam across the gap without connecting the two ends, I would not have a continuous guideline to the surface. This wasn't a big deal. I already knew the cave well enough to make my way through the maze of tunnels, as long as I had good visibility. If the visibility was disturbed, then it would be a very big deal. I could find my way around as long as I could see the walls and the floor and the ceiling. Without being able to see anything, that guideline was my only way of finding the opening to the surface. It was literally my lifeline. We don't just go into these underwater caves blindly. That would be crazy. Some of you may be thinking that cave diving is crazy in and of itself. It might be. But cave diving without a continuous guideline is even crazier. It's suicidal. So many things can happen that make it unsafe to do that. The guidelines we set in the cave are not there to get us into the cave. They help with that, but that's not their primary purpose. The very first person that ventures into an underwater cave runs a guideline from the opening through the tunnel that's being explored. Just like Hansel left a trail of breadcrumbs when he and Gretel made their way into the woods, we leave a line when we make our way into a cave. The difference is that our lines won't get eaten by fish or dissolved by the water, at least not right away. Most of the lines remain in the cave tunnels permanently. These lines do what Hansel intended to do with his trail of breadcrumbs. They let us know how to retrace our path back out to the surface. Without them, well, it could be a bad thing. Why do we use guidelines? Why don't we just place our line markers on the floor of the cave and retrieve them as we exit? We place markers shaped like arrows and cookies on the lines to help us navigate. Dry cavers will sometimes mark walls with chalk to mark their way out. Why don't underwater cave divers do something similar? Why not forego the lines? If we didn't run lines through the passages, we would have to carry hundreds of line markers so we could place them close enough to each other to be able to see them. A typical 2-hour-long cave dive can mean seeing more than a mile of cave passages in an underwater cave. If we placed a marker every 50 feet, that would require more than 100 markers. Second, if we placed the line markers on the floor of the cave, they would only help us get out if we continued to have good visibility in the cave. Those markers wouldn't do us any good if the visibility in the cave was suddenly diminished or completely gone. A dry caver only has to be concerned with having enough lights to get in and out of the cave. A cave diver needs lights, but also needs to not disturb the sediment typically covering the floor of the cave. Sediment that, if disturbed, will decrease or even eliminate the visibility in a water-filled cave. I remember the first time I ran a guideline into a previously unlined cave passage. It wasn't a huge passage. Actually, it was rather small. I knew the visibility would likely be diminished just because of my movement through it. I knew that line would be my only indication of which way would lead me out of the passage and back into the main passage of the cave. The risk of silting out an underwater cave is almost always present. Silting out means the sediment on the floor gets disturbed and rises into the water. Think of it as driving along a country road in heavy fog. Or for those of you in the colder regions, think of driving through a snowstorm. Only sometimes that fog or snowfall is so heavy you can't see an inch in front of your headlights. You might not be able to see an inch in front of your windshield. If you've ever encountered such conditions, you've probably pulled over rather than risk driving into another car or a deer, or even a moose. That isn't an option in an underwater cave. You only have so much air in your tanks. While there are some caves with high enough current that any sediment that may have been in them is pushed off of the floor and out of the cave, those are rare. Even high-flow caves, the caves with strong, fast current, have areas with sediment-covered floors farther inside that are shielded from the current. No cave is immune to a silt-out. A fast current in a cave will not help clear out the silt more quickly. It can actually have the opposite effect. There's a cave in Florida, not far from where I live, where the visibility gets worse when the flow is higher. This is because the faster current stirs the sediment on the floor and pushes it up into the water column. This drops the visibility in the cave to well below 10 feet. The visibility in that cave is better when the current isn't so strong. There are 3 types of sediment in caves: sand, mud, and clay. Clay is the worst of the 3. When clay is disturbed, cave divers will find themselves in the heaviest fog imaginable. They not only can't see that car driving toward them in the other lane, but they also can't see the front of their own car. They might not even be able to see the hood. It's time to pull off the road to a safe place where they won't be hit by that crazy driver that hasn't pulled over yet. I remember my first time in a silt-out so bad that I couldn't see my dive light. I couldn't even see the glow from my dive light. The clay particles engulfed the beam and absorbed it. My only reference to my location was the thin white line I held in my hand. Without that line, I would have been left to wander aimlessly in the cave, running into walls while trying to find visibility again. In a clay silt-out, the visibility will be diminished, and possibly even completely gone for several hours. Clay can cause true zero visibility conditions. I've been in clay silt-outs in Cozumel, in Florida, in which I couldn't see the light from my 8,000 lumen primary light. I don't mean the light beam. I mean the illumination from the light with it pointed at my face just inches away. Not even a glow. For those of you that aren't familiar with how bright an 8,000 lumen light is, it's blindingly bright. Far brighter than the high beams on cars. In a clay silt-out, the environment becomes pitch black. Close your eyes for a few seconds. That's what it looks like in a clay silt-out, and it lasts for hours. Good luck finding those markers on that floor in that. I've also been in partial silt-outs. Those are almost worse than complete loss of visibility. The glow of the light can be disorienting. I spent many hours moving through cave passages in both Cozumel and Florida with my eyes closed. With my eyes open, my brain insists that I should be seeing something. With them closed, it gets what it expects. Mud is almost as bad as clay, except the dive light might still be visible. The glow will be there, just not as bright or defined. Mud particles also won't hang in the water column for quite as long as clay particles. Rather than several hours, they will only remain in the water for a few hours. That's more time than we allot in our scuba tanks for emergency situations. Mud will still be in the water column long after the air in the scuba tanks has been depleted. A cave diver in that situation will have to use the guideline to get out of the cave. Not all is good just because there's enough visibility to see a few feet in a mud silt-out. It's not. You won't be able to see those markers on the floor until you're just inches above them. That would be a slow and painful process from a mile inside of a cave, even from only 1,000 feet inside of a cave. At this point, you're probably thinking back to my comment about being crazy. We as cave divers must be crazy to subject ourselves to these harsh environments where the visibility can be obliterated with the errant kick of a fin tip and leave us in complete blackness with the only reference to the exit being a thin piece of string that looks like it can break at any moment. When you put it that way, I've even had someone comment on one of the videos on my YouTube channel asking why we don't use something more substantial. The line we use may be small, but it's durable in most environments. Besides clay and mud, there's sand, which is the most benign. The particles are large enough that they quickly fall back to the floor. Visibility is usually restored in a matter of seconds rather than minutes or hours. Even when the sand is in the water column, there's enough visibility to see some things, maybe even the cave wall a few feet away. The problem is that it's rare to encounter only sand on the floor of these caves. There will usually be some mud or clay mixed in. So while the larger sand particles settle down quickly, the other stuff, the mud and the clay, hangs in the water and destroys the visibility. I know what you're thinking. Now we sound really crazy for doing what we do. We would be, except silt-outs are rare events. Most cave divers will never see diminished visibility inside of a cave. Diminished visibility is more likely to happen in the smaller tunnels and during exploration. Because of this, I have experienced a fair amount of diminished visibility, more than the average cave diver. I've exited many caves not being able to see a thing, I'm still here, and it's because of the guidelines. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of training and experience that also goes into it, but no amount of training and experience will get you out of the cave without a reliable guideline. The possibility of diminished visibility is one of the reasons we place guidelines in underwater caves. It's the main reason. The lines aren't there to show us where to go on the way in. It's easy to swim into a cave and follow the tunnels. The hard part is getting out. It's kind of like flying an airplane. Flying is easy. It's the landing that's hard. So the guidelines are there to lead us out of the cave should we lose visibility. They give us something we can feel and follow out. They allow us to have a smooth landing. They are literally our lifelines out of the cave. One of the rules of cave diving is to always maintain a continuous guideline to the surface. We secure the beginning of the line below the surface where once we return to it, even if we still can't see anything, we know we can let go and ascend to the surface where we can finally breathe without our scuba tanks and regulators. Why, then, do we have gaps in the guidelines inside of the caves if we depend on having a continuous guideline? Shouldn't those gaps be eliminated? Shouldn't there always be a continuous guideline? As with anything, there are limits to actions that can be taken to make things safer. Sometimes not having a gap can make things a little riskier, so we intentionally place gaps in the lines to increase safety. Clear as mud? Most caves are mazes of tunnels that go in all directions. Some tunnels continue for hundreds or even thousands of feet before abruptly ending. Other tunnels may eventually loop back and connect to the main tunnel or some other section of the cave. Take a look at the original line map of one of the caves in Cozumel on my website, cozcaves, COZCAVES.com. You can ignore the dashed lines. They are roads on the surface. The solid lines are the cave tunnels that have been lined, surveyed, and mapped. You can see how confusing it can get, especially in the center of the cross-section. And this is just what had been found and explored in that cave at the time. There are more tunnels on my map of this cave that are not depicted in this cross-section from the original map. The guideline in what we call the main passage, the main tunnel that leads from the opening in which we access the cave, is typically a single line that continues for thousands of feet. There will usually be offshoot tunnels along the main tunnel. I say usually because that's not always the case. There are some caves that are linear and have no offshoot tunnels or don't have any offshoots for several hundred or thousands of feet. Most caves in Mexico, those in Cozumel included, have multitudes of tunnels. So many that they can't even be called offshoots. We choose to not connect the guidelines from these offshoot tunnels to the guideline in the main tunnel because not everyone is going to leave the main tunnel. For one reason or another, the offshoot tunnels aren't that popular. It could be because they're just a short run that dead ends or loops back into the main tunnel. It could be because they get small and beyond the comfort level of most divers. It could also be that it leads to another section of the cave that divers visit, just not that often. Regardless of the reason for the gap, when divers go into these offshoots, they use a line from spools they carry with them to connect the main guideline and the offshoot tunnel guideline before heading into that section. These are referred to as jump spools because they are used to jump from one guideline to another. The jump spools establish a continuous guideline back to the surface. On the way out from that section, the jump spool lines are removed so the guidelines can be restored to their original state. When other divers go into the cave, they then don't have to deal with a line intersection if they intend to go beyond that area. Line intersections occur when you have a line tied onto another permanently. In cave diving, we call them line tees because many of them exist at 90-degree angles or close to it. An intersection creates a fork in the tunnel and a decision must be made about which way to go. The decision is easier on the way in. It doesn't matter which line you follow unless you're trying to get somewhere in particular. However, on the way out, you typically only have one option to get yourself out of the cave. You might recognize which line to follow if you have good visibility. If you're in a silt out, it becomes much more difficult. You'll read about several line intersections that I had to swim past. Line tees, such as the ones described in this book, won't typically be found in most underwater caves. They are more likely to be encountered farther back in the tourist caves or in non-tourist caves. Non-tourist caves are caves that aren't frequented by most cave divers. Line tees are more likely to be found in caves being actively explored and surveyed because it makes it easier for the explorers. Most of the caves I've explored in Cozumel have a lot more line intersections than are typically found in a cave. Many years ago, while diving a Florida cave, I came across several line intersections in close proximity to each other, more than 2,000 feet from the opening. They all had line arrows pointing back the way I had come. I decided I didn't need to place any additional line arrows. The arrows already on the lines told me what I wanted to know, until I arrived at an intersection which had the arrow pointing the way I was going. It was easy enough to deal with. I could place my own marker at the intersection, except the intersection looked very familiar. I thought I might have looped back to where I had started. The disorientation to my exact location in the cave was unnerving enough that I quickly turned around and made my way back. I never went beyond a line intersection without marking it with my own marker after that. We have methods we use to deal with line intersections when we are exiting a cave, so we don't have to rely on memory, something I did in that last example. Relying on memory may work in good visibility when you must only recall 2 or 3 intersections. However, if the visibility is diminished and the lines aren't visible, you'll need to know how to get out using tactile senses. Your memory may also be put to the test if you pass by several line intersections on a single dive. I think the most intersections I've gone past on a single cave dive was 17, and I did that dive many times. That was in Cozumel after finding a section that had previously been unexplored. This was a section that had more tunnels in it than all of the tunnels shown on the original map of the cave. You'll get to read about it in the next book in the Beneath the Jungle of Cozumel series. If we typically leave line intersections in place during exploration, why not leave them after exploration is completed? We minimize the number of line intersections in certain areas of the caves we dive because it makes it easier to follow the guideline out of the cave in zero visibility. It's faster to follow a single line out than to have to stop and determine which one of the 2 lines will lead you out of the way you came in. When we can't see the lines, we maintain contact with them and use them to make our way to the opening of the cave. We do this by forming a circle with our thumb and forefinger around the guideline without placing any tension on it. We then swim above or next to the guideline as it passes through the circle we formed with our fingers. When we encounter a line intersection, we feel for those line arrows or line cookies that I mentioned previously. We place them on the lines to direct us out of the cave. We feel the lines, searching for the line markers we left there on the way in, so we know how to continue out of the cave even in diminished visibility. We must trust the markers, even when we can't see them. We must trust them even when our brains are trying to tell us to go a different way. That happens more often than you'd think. There are so many procedures we must learn that just involve the guidelines. It's no wonder cave diving training is broken up into 2 to 5 day classes and has 3 levels of proficiency. This training is typically done over the course of a couple of years. There are some zero to hero cave divers out there, the ones that do the course in 8 to 10 consecutive days. New graduates of those courses will still be learning years after completion. They can't learn everything involved and become proficient in such a short time without some practice to reinforce the procedures learned. Hopefully they don't immediately rush to the back of the cave shortly after they complete their training and find themselves in a situation that leads to their demise. The ones that take their time and spread it out over several months or years and build their experience by diving the caves at the various levels of training are better cave divers. They give themselves time to absorb all of the information that gets fed to them in class and during training dives. They allow themselves time to develop the skills they learned. The procedure for following a line out of a cave in zero visibility involves always maintaining contact with the line using one of your hands. If you arrive at a line intersection or a line wrap, you maintain contact with the line you were following while you determine which line you will continue to follow with your other hand. If you arrive at a point where the line is wrapped around a formation, one hand remains in contact with the line you've been following. You use your other hand to trace the line around the formation until you find where the line takes off again, making sure there is only one other line branching off from the wrap. Only when you have correctly determined you are on the line leading to the cave opening do you let go of the line you had been following. Familiarity with a cave helps to make this process more efficient. Unfamiliarity increases the risk. I taught cave diving for many years. I always tried to put my students into situations in which they were forced to encounter a confusing line wrap because they exist in the real world. In fact, I used a real-world line wrap to conduct the training exercise. I had more than one student do that procedure incorrectly and end up going back into the cave, away from the opening, rather than continue out of the cave. Their mistake was releasing contact with the guideline, so they ended up back on the line they were following, only heading in the opposite direction. That can be a fatal mistake when an instructor isn't there to correct it. All of this sounds like a lot of information to absorb, particularly for newer divers, which is why we tend to not have intersections in the section of the cave that's near the opening. We minimize the number of line intersections to simplify navigation and make things safer for newer and experienced cave divers who haven't been trained to deal with navigational decisions. We all have to start somewhere. I arrived at that first gap, or jump, in the line about 300 feet from where I began the dive. As I mentioned, cave divers carry jump spools, small spools made of Delrin or stainless steel with anywhere from 50 to 100 feet of line wrapped around them. We use the line to connect the two ends of the guidelines at either end of the jump. The free end of the jump spool line is wrapped around the end of the guideline nearest you, and the line is let out as you swim toward the end of the line opposite from you. Once there, the line from the jump spool is wrapped around the permanent guideline and clipped to the spool using the double-ender bolt snap carried for that purpose. The last thing that's done is a personalized line marker is placed on the line coming from the spool. This is that round cookie-shaped marker I mentioned. We call it a non-directional marker, or simply a cookie. This lets anyone passing through know that that jump spool was placed there and the diver is still in the cave, so it shouldn't be removed. It's part of the continuous guideline to the surface that will get the diver out. Once the jump spool line is in place, continuing into the cave, following the permanent guideline can be done knowing that if the visibility deteriorates, there's a continuous guideline to the opening. After bridging the gap, I had another several hundred feet until I arrived at the area of the cave that I recognized from my many previous visits. There were formations in the area that alerted me that I had arrived. When I first found the passage, I didn't mark the guideline in any way because I had a feeling that the connection to Dos Coronas was nearby. I didn't want to leave any clues as to my exploration efforts. I didn't want anyone to scoop my lead, so I kept it hidden. There weren't many cave divers diving Cueva Quebrada. It wasn't an easy cave to access. The cenote entrance was deep in the jungle, along a narrow, indistinct path. All that cave diving equipment that must be brought into the cave had to be carried through the jungle to the cenote. This included scuba tanks. That was well over 250 pounds of gear to carry on multiple trips through those 400 plus feet of jungle while trying to keep from tripping over rocks and uneven ground. Most cave divers prefer to be able to back their trucks up to a picnic table and walk a few feet to the water. That doesn't happen in Cozumel. Once I found my landmarks in the tunnel, I placed a line arrow on the guideline, pointing toward the direction I came from, back along my continuous line to the surface. I grabbed another jump spool and secured the line over the arrow. If the visibility happened to be diminished when I returned, I'd still know which way to go on the line by feeling the lines and finding my arrow. I knew the cave well enough that I would remember which way I needed to turn, but just in case, it was always better to have a reminder in place. This was especially true after passing through 17 intersections. Thankfully, that wasn't the case for this dive. With the end of the line secured around my marker, I swam away from the guideline in the direction of where I had placed line in the cave 6 months earlier. That line was out of the way, tucked behind a wall and hidden from the main tunnel. I found my line and wrapped the jump spool line onto it, secured it back onto itself, and placed another marker on the jump spool line, a non-directional cookie this time. I glanced back at my dive buddy David, and signaled him with my light, and he returned the signal. Why the pause? Because we were about to go through a section of cave I had named the Grinder.